That was awfully sedate. Do you think you could do it again and make it a little more boisterous? Yeah! Thank you all for being here. My name is Victoria Wilson, and I'd like to thank, first of all, Kimberly Green for that nice introduction, and I'd like to congratulate Tom Healy for becoming the new head of the Miami Book Fair, and also to thank Mitch Kaplan for his 31st anniversary. To you,
Congratulations.
Mitch. Actually, this fair is almost as old as Anne's marriage to me. We've been married for about 40 years, and we're living happily ever after. Yes. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here because it was pouring in New York today and it was freezing. So, Anne, let's start. We have...
Absolutely.
Good.
Okay.
All right, so in the writing of Prince Lestat, talk a little bit about the process of your writing this particular book.
Well, what it took, first of all, was a commitment that I really was going to allow this to happen, or was willing to see whether I could bring Lestat back. And I've never managed to put together a character like Lestat. I mean, Lestat's unique in my experience. He's real to me. He feels like he comes from somewhere else and channels through me. And I was convinced that I couldn't bring him back. I'm not exactly sure why, but I had been convinced for a number of years that I couldn't do it. And suddenly, for some reason, I started to entertain the possibility. It might have been because people emailed me almost every day asking me to bring him back, and they came on my Facebook page and said, "Where is Lestat?" And I really at first thought, no, it's just not going to work. I can't do it. Anyway, the decision was made that I was going to try. And I started to read my old books, and I was amazed at how much I missed him, missed Armand, Louis, Marius, all of the different characters in the Vampire Chronicles, and how many new ideas were coming to me, and how many new stories. And basically, the novel started to build in my head, all kinds of, I started taking notes, writing sample chapters. None of it really went anywhere, but it was all collecting and helping me to get close to these characters again. And that continued to build, and finally the novel poured out. And when it started rolling, it just really rolled, and it was a very exciting process for me. I was very glad to have Lestat back. I felt there was an intensity there that I just don't feel with any other character I write about, and it was an incredible experience.
Were you surprised when the Lestat voice excuse me, came back? Did you say, "Oh, what are you doing there again?"
No, he came back kind of early. He told me that he would talk to me again. But, you know, it took a while for me to get into the story I wanted to tell. I knew I wanted to do a book with all of the tribe. I wanted to write about all the vampires. This was a choice. I wanted to do that. And I hadn't done that since The Queen of the Damned, which was the third book in the Vampire Chronicles, and it was published, I think, in 1989, I believe. And I wasn't quite sure I could pull that off. I knew I might have to fall back and do a book all from Lestat's point of view about him, but I really had something different in mind, and that took some doing, I think, to just give in and surrender to various characters and let them have their chapters in the third person, let them tell me their stories. And you know, some of these characters, they come, again, it feels like you're channeling something from the astral plane. I mean, there were characters that just popped up and kind of demanded to be in the book. It was, I can't exactly explain how that happened. There were other choices I made to go back and resurrect characters that I'd passed over, that I felt really had stories that I'd never told. And one of those, for example, was a character named Antoine, who was just referred to as the musician in Interview with the Vampire. And that character really came to life for me on the page in a very exciting way, as I tried to get the scope of his existence in the U.S. From the time of the Civil War on. And anyway, it was a very exciting process for me. And it's a matter of surrendering. It's a matter of sort of having the nerve to reach for something that seems almost too big to do, and also acknowledging that it's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be what I hope it will be. You know, it'll be what it's meant to be in a way.
Right, exactly. The best that it can be, the best that you can do. I mean, as somebody we've had these conversations for so many years as you're working in process, and the truth is that for every book, there are the voices that say, I'm not sure I can do this. And I think that is just a natural thing that people...
Oh yeah. And then sometimes people around you tell you can't do something. I know when I decided after 9 years after Interview with the Vampire, I wanted to do the Vampire Lestat, and I wanted to do it from Lestat's point of view. And there were people who advised me not to do it. They said, just don't touch that book, it won't work. There'll be invidious comparisons, don't do it. And I thought, I'm going to do this. I want to do this. I'm going to make this work. And of course, I produced a book that was wholly unlike Interview with the Vampire. And that was quite a journey. That was a book I had the most trouble with, probably, of any book I've ever written, actually, the Vampire Lestat. But it did finally pour out and come together, and actually it launched the series, the Vampire Chronicles. There was no real series with the first book. It came about with Lestat as a hero, and it came about with his book.
And I think that what's important is to definitely never listen to anybody who says not to do something, and to trust your instinct and those inner voices, except when the inner voices are taking on, don't do this, don't do this.
Oh, absolutely.
And then you just say, thank you for sharing, and just move on.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's somebody standing by the desk of every writer in creation saying, what makes you think you can be a writer?
Exactly.
What makes you think the world's going to read anything you write? I mean, I've been hearing that voice all my life. I heard it when I was a kid, out loud, You have to ignore those voices. You have to not take no for an answer, and you can't take no for an answer from yourself either.
So in talking about Interview with a Vampire, when you first wrote about Louis in Interview, I'm curious to know, what of your childhood figured in that book?
What was what?
What if your childhood figured in Interview with a Vampire?
Oh, I don't know. I went into that book like entering a dream, and I believe completely in that vampire. He was a cape-wearing comic book image, basically, a beautiful man. I based him physically on the French actor Alain Delon, and I saw him, very alive, very vivid, and I let him talk to me. And I think everything I knew went into it. I'm not sure what from my childhood went into it. Certainly my love of the South and my longing for the South was in it, and my grief over my lost Catholic faith, all that was in that novel. And my own passivity and my own self-loathing because of my passivity and melancholy. I was Louis. Louis was me. I'm the only woman who's ever been played by Brad Pitt in a movie. Thank you. It's kind of fun.
There's a headline. Talk a little bit about, well, let me just ask you this, then what about New Orleans, which you just mentioned, but what about growing up in New Orleans stayed with you and you think is in your books?
Well, I missed New Orleans from the day I'd left it when I was a teenager and headed to Texas and then out to California, and every chance I got, I went back to New Orleans, even if it was for 24 hours, and I was in Berkeley, California, working on Interview with the Vampire, and I'd actually been doing research on Louisiana history at the University of California Library. And I was filled with a lot of details and facts about antebellum Louisiana and the plantations and the legends and the lore of the city. And when I started to do Interview with the Vampire, I didn't really have to look anything up. All that was there in my mind. And I traveled back to my home, which to me seemed the most beautiful place on earth, one of the most sensuous and special places on earth. I don't think there's any city in the world quite like New Orleans. The fact that it's an American city and the fact that it is what it is makes it absolutely unique. And I tried to capture that in a very special way in the book. I tried to capture what the glamour of New Orleans and the Gothic atmosphere of New Orleans meant to me as a child. I was one of those kids who really did walk around the streets looking at the old Spanish houses in the French Quarter and the Greek revival houses uptown and just marveling at how beautiful they were. And I always was a little puzzled that everybody around me wasn't just amazed by it all. So many of us took it for granted. And anyway, I tried to get all that in the novel. The vampire was like an outgrowth of all of that. It seemed the perfect place for a vampire. And
I think you got that in the novel, and more.
I hope that that's there. But then, of course, the story started to grow of Lestat and Louis, the child vampire Claudia, what happened to them. They're wanting to go to Europe, which was something I wanted to do very much at that time. I'd never been to Europe, never been to New York at that age. And I wanted to see the world, and I put that into my characters. And then, of course, the story took its inevitable tragic turn, and the book became about many, many things beyond my comprehension, really, and a lot beyond my conscious intent. But it felt authentic, it felt good, and I trusted my subconscious, and I trusted whatever governing madness was involved there.
Talk a little bit about the Bronte sisters and their influence on your writing. And really, what is it about? Well, let's take that part first.
I think I stumbled on Jane Eyre in the school library when I was a kid. And I don't think I ever took it home. I'm not sure we could take it home. I read the whole thing in the high school library over my freshman year. And I fell under the spell of Jane Eyre totally. I thought it was absolutely incredible. It was difficult for me to read. I was a slow reader. I'm not a natural reader. I wasn't at that time. But I knew I wanted to live in the world of Jane Eyre. I didn't even know the words for it all. Romanticism, whatever. I didn't know those distinctions. I just knew that this was it. This was what the world was to me, the world of Jane Eyre. Also read at the same time in the freshman English class Dickens' Great Expectations, and I was completely swept up in that also. I identified completely with Pip, the little boy in that novel who wants to be something more than what life has planned for him. And he is seduced by what he sees at Miss Havisham's house, this mysterious woman, as I'm sure most of you know, who wears her bridal gown day in and day out because she was jilted at the altar. And she's sort of like a ghost who's actually alive and a ghost at the same time. And I love that. I love the imagination of Great Expectations, but I love the passion of Jane Eyre. Mm-hmm. The absolute passion, Jane's voice, Jane's personal voice. And those two novels really shaped me as a writer. That was where I wanted to go. I didn't really know American literature very well. And I'd been in Catholic schools where we really didn't read Hemingway or Fitzgerald or read a lot of contemporary, at least not in the schools I was in, we didn't. And those books really sent me on a journey, and it was to be a romantic and to trust in the romantic sensibility.
And let me ask you, your husband, Stan Rice, who was a poet, very acclaimed poet, and a painter, was a marvelous painter. Do you think that Stan is in your writing, and if so, how?
Oh, well, Stan very much inspired Lestat. There's no question. I mean, no character I write is really ever based on a living person, but living people inspire the characters. Mm-hmm. And actually, the night I was describing Lestat walking up to Louis's bed and offering him the dark gift, I actually went in and said, I've got to get out of these dark-haired, deep-set-eyed descriptions here. I've got to describe something new. So I went in and looked at Stan and studied him, and I thought, okay, athletic grace, shoulder-length blonde hair, pale eyes. I got it. Yeah, androgynous movements. Yeah, okay, and I ran back to the typewriter and actually described Lestat exactly that way, standing by the bed. So Stan was very much the guiding force. And also, Stan was a very decisive person. He was not a guilt-ridden, melancholy human being like me. He was an atheist. He had a great deal of self-confidence. He was very forceful, very decisive, and that was Lestat right there. That was the two of us. Lestat and Louis was standing in a way. But again, the novel developed from there. Lestat really became his own person in the novel. And it was just the springboard, just the starting point. Same with Claudia. Claudia was obviously physically based on my daughter Michelle, who had just died. But I was really not trying to write about Michelle. I mean, that was the last thing in my mind. If I'd thought about that, I would have been blocked. Right. I would have thought, how can you use your daughter's death like this in a novel? I mean, I truly blocked it out.
You've written so many different kinds of books, but among the books there are books about angels, and not saints necessarily, but they do figure somewhere in the back of your work. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about how you think of them and what they mean to you.
Well, in a way, the vampires I wanted to be like angels. I wanted them not to be feral like Dracula, but to be preternatural and etheric like angels. That was an idea that I had very early on, that my vampires were going to be enhanced by the dark gift, to where they were like angelic in appearance almost, and in their powers, a bit like angels. But later on, I came to write Angel Time and Of Love and Evil, two actual novels in which an angel is featured, and I want to get back to that series and write a third book. And in that book, I tried to really deal with heavenly angels according to angel traditional lore. I was very dissatisfied with the angels of television and movies, who are generally very sad sack individuals who would rather be alive on earth than be in heaven. And I thought, that just can't make any sense, And I wanted to have a powerful angel like Malchiah in the book, who was really quite happy being a seraph and was down here for a purpose, and that purpose was to enlist Toby to become a child of the angels and work with the angels to answer prayers.
I didn't have this question written down, but it's something that struck me always about you, was so amazing. This notion, it's not really a notion, it's this being, this sort of pageantry, this sort of life on a grand scale. The sort of richness of detail in your houses. But then buying St. Elizabeth's and having that vision. I mean, what was that with you always, or? Well,
it was. I mean, I grew up on the edge of a beautiful old neighborhood in New Orleans that had these huge Greek revival homes, and it seemed to me that the world was filled with pageantry and incredible images. I went to a church, St. Alphonsus, in my parish, that was a great big Baroque Rococo church filled with gorgeous statues from Europe and stained glass, and it had been built lovingly by the Irish immigrants, my ancestors, who came from Ireland in the 1850s to New Orleans and built that church. And I grew up going to daily mass in that church and sitting there in the pews and looking at all of that art. And actually, I didn't fully understand the context of it all till I went to Italy later and understood more what the Baroque period of art was in Italy. But it was a magnificent school in which the imagination could flourish. And I read the Lives of the Saints when I was in school. I was never interested in anything that wasn't exceptional, I guess. I mean, I lived in a dream world of saints, angels, heroes, heroines. The radio shows I listened to and loved all revolved around that. And I was often told as a young writer not to write about those things. I was told to write about ordinary people and ordinary things. And this is a strong theme in American letters. I don't know if you remember the movie I Remember Mama. Mm-hmm. The little girl wants to be a writer, and she writes wonderful imaginative stories, but then a great writer or great professional writer is asked about the stories, and she says she needs to write about ordinary things, her own life. Well, this is a theme that we reinforce all the time. A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, pretty much the same thing. Don't write about a starving artist in a garret in Paris, but write about Brooklyn, where you grew up. And that's good advice for a certain kind of writer, but it wasn't good advice for me. I really took flight as a writer when I stopped trying to write pedestrian realism about what I knew, the people around me, and I actually gave way to the imagination and wrote about my vampire in the black cape.
And talk about, I don't know if, how many people here have read Cry to Heaven?
Wow, that's a lot.
How many people here haven't read Cry to Heaven? Raise your hands. Okay, you've got a fabulous treat in store for you. Talk a little bit about the writing of that book, because it's an extraordinary book.
Well, Cry to Heaven is a novel set in 18th century Italy, but it's really not a historical novel exactly. It's more the story of a young man who's castrated and becomes a great castrati opera singer. And I was interested more in his personality and his tragedy, what happened to him when he was robbed of his manhood, basically, and his gender identity, and yet became a superstar. And to me, he seemed as dazzling an outcast as any vampire. And I wanted to explore that world for everything that I could, especially the sensual life of that being. What that was like for Tonio, my hero in that book, what it was like for him to love both men and women, and to make some sort of erotic identity for himself in spite of the terrible wound he had incurred in the castration. And again, it was outsiders. See, that was where I began to see that that's what I wanted to write about. I had written a novel right before about the free people of color of Louisiana, and they were a very wonderful society that existed in the French Quarter in New Orleans before the Civil War. They were octoroons, quadroons, mulattoes, who were free, but who were distrusted and subordinate to the white people of Louisiana, and yet they had their own group. They were outcasts, but they had their own group. They published the first anthology of poetry ever published in Louisiana. It was published by men of color, about in the 1840s, and they fascinated me. But it was only with Cry to Heaven that I saw that was the theme. That's what united the vampires, the free people of color, and the castrati. They were all outcasts, but they were a certain kind of outcast that had a certain exalted life, or the potential.
They were regal in their own.
Yes.
In their own.
They were. They had their own group. They had their own hierarchy, and they had their own way of making life more than interesting, for themselves.
Well, because the next question, of course, I was going to ask you is, well, when do you think you started really to write about the free people of color? Not literally, but when did you really start to think about that?
Oh, I was thinking about them before I wrote Interview with the Vampire. That was the book I was working on, was Feast of All Saints about the free people of color. I just wasn't ready to do it. That's the research I was doing at the University of California in Berkeley. I was doing research on the history of black people in America before the Civil War and in the Caribbean. And I accumulated an enormous amount of information, more than I could ever put into that novel. I did put a lot of it in there, but it was amazing how much I found and how many surprising things I found. I actually broke off from that to write Interview with the Vampire. It wasn't a conscious choice. I took out the story I'd done called Interview with the Vampire and started to rewrite it and became the novel. And again, I didn't have to do any research for Louis' plantation or the economy or what people wore because I'd done it all for the novel. So after that was finished, then I went to the free people of color and wrote what is, I guess, nearly truly a historical novel, maybe the only one that I ever wrote, insofar as that it was also about illustrating history. But it was, again, more about the personalities, the young people, and what they suffered growing up in that society, being so well-bred, so well-dressed, but completely dependent on the charity of a white father who was not their legal father.
But do you think you got that from watching the people in New Orleans and where, as you were growing up as a child?
Not so much, because my childhood was very limited. I actually didn't know very much about the black history of New Orleans when I was a child. I found all that out in the library and then on my trips back. And of course, I realized how limited my childhood was,
So when you're writing a book, since I have now had this experience, it's interesting to me. And it's you and the world that you're creating. Mm-hmm. And then you finish the book, and first of all, how does it describe how it feels once people start coming into the world between you and the world that you've created? When they start reading the book and start reacting to it.
Well, it's wildly exciting. I mean, there's nothing more exciting than picking up the phone and saying, "Vicki, it's finished. You know,
Right.
I'm ready to email it to you now." You know, I mean, to me, it's so exciting. I can't explain it. But of course, it's frightening. What if I email it to you and you say, "This is awful. I can't see this at all."
Right.
You know, that was in fact one of the rejection letters on Interview with the Vampire from the famous Michael Korda. He said, "Alas, I can't see this at all," and rejected the novel.
Right.
So,
And
but
then,
I mean, so that's a
and
frightening.
then fortunately I could. And
Yes,
did.
You did see it, and you know, it turned out wonderfully well. And but I used to get terribly depressed when I finished novels.
But once you've sort of finished it and people start responding to it, that's fabulous and exciting. But do you feel like it's sort of leaving you? It's belonging to other people.
Yeah, but at this point in my life, after this many novels, it's very exciting. I'm glad to see it go out there. I'm glad to see it go out there and start living in the world.
Right.
Living in the world. And of course, I have a group of people to whom I give my manuscripts to read, my sister, my son, a couple of other friends Beckett, my assistant, and they give me just very basic, respectful feedback, what they liked, what they didn't, how it struck them. And that's exciting to me, to get that feedback, to hear what they say. And I especially like it when my sister's reading, because I can watch her when she's reading. We live in the same house, and I can tell when she really likes something because she just won't stop reading it, you know, and she's carrying it around the house and moving very fast through the pages. So yeah, all that's very exciting for me. Years ago, it was more scary. It was more frightening, and I would get violently depressed when I left my own imaginative world and had to go back to just being without my obsession.
What do you think your bond is to, it's true you have a Jewish editor, but what do you think your bond is to the Jewish religion and the history of the Jews?
Well, my great-grandmother was Jewish.
Wait a minute. Your great-grandmother was Jewish on your mother's side?
No, my father's side.
Okay.
No, I'm not. It was broken.
I was going to say, wait a minute, this is amazing. Aunt's Jewish.
Well, I'm just as genetically Jewish, but it's not through the maternal line, right? Yes. So it doesn't count. But Josephine Becker was her name, and she was Jewish. And my father and my mother always had a great reverence and respect for Jewish people, and they always enthralled me, and I did not grow up in an anti-Semitic environment, perhaps simply because there weren't very many Jewish people around, and it was not something that came up in our little Catholic world of New Orleans. There was a great respect for Jesus having been Jewish and part of a Jewish family, and I didn't get all the cliches. I didn't discover all the anti-Semitism till later. But early on, I was very attracted to the Jewish religion, and years later, when I began to do research on Jesus, you sent me a book by Paula Fredrickson called Jesus of Nazareth, and Paula Fredrickson is one of those New Testament scholars who puts an enormous emphasis on the Jewish life of Jesus and what it was like. Palestine at that time, Jewish society in the time of the Second Temple. And that book had a tremendous effect on me. You just sent it to me. I don't even remember why, just to see it.
I published it. But
But
I thought beyond that, I thought that you would have a response to it.
Yeah, I did, and I liked it very much. I had a strong response. But I was at that time actually doing a lot of research on the Jewish people. And I was very interested. That was it. I had done Servant of the Bones, and that was all about the captivity in Babylon. And I was enthralled with the story of the Jews in history, very much enthralled. Yeah.
You know, you mentioned your mother. Describe her to us.
Oh, she was a brilliant woman of great spiritual ambition, and she was my life up till around the age of 4 or 5. My father was away in the Navy, and I didn't actually know him. He was just a picture on the mantle. The war was going on, And my mother was like an angel in the lives of my sister Alice and me. She read poetry to us all the time to teach us rhythm. And we grew up in a world where she told us we could do anything we wanted to do, we could accomplish anything. She would tell us wonderful stories as we were growing up about the Bronte sisters, about George Eliot, about English female writers and what they'd had to go through, you know, to be published and accepted. And she made us feel that there was nothing we couldn't do. She never imposed any sort of really strong gender identity on us, I don't think. I certainly grew up with no gender identity, really. You know, just the most superficial awareness of what gender identity meant. And because we were a family eventually of 4 daughters, and there were no brothers, and because I went to Catholic schools that were girls' schools, I didn't really become aware of gender and the problems of gender till I was about 15, you know, and it was quite a shock from which I never recovered, really. True.
Do you think there was something that your mother would have wanted to do with her life other than?
She wanted to give it all to her children. That's really what she wanted. She was not a person who wanted any kind of creative dimension for herself. It was all us. She wanted to give it all to us. And she supported my father in his writing. My father wrote short stories and poetry, but I don't know why she herself never wanted to write, because she was, in fact, a great storyteller. Just a great storyteller. She told me over the years the stories of so many movies. Later in life, I'd tune into these movies and realize, I know this whole story. My mother told me this, you know. I mean, she must have told me, because we weren't living in the archival culture that we live in today, where you can get any old movie anytime you want it. When a movie disappeared out of the theaters, it was gone. So she was passing on heritage to us, really. And her life had a tragic dimension. There's no question about that. She died young while she was still very beautiful, and she died tragically. And
what do you think you learned from her? What was
confidence, strength, that I was a complete human being and could do anything that I wanted to do, really. I mean, I learned that from her above all. And she just had a warmth and we had a camaraderie that was terrific. I in a way, have done everything I've ever done for my mother.
That's great. And what happened when your father came home, and when you were 4?
Yes.
And
yeah.
How did life change? And
Well, it didn't change all that much, but it was nice meeting him, you know, and he was a writer. He did write. He wrote a children's novel called The Impulsive Imp, and he read chapters of it to me and my sister in the evening, and we'd give him our feedback, and he'd consult us about what he was doing in the novel. And so I grew up there with the example of him being a writer. Now, he never did get the novel published, but, you know, I don't know in retrospect how hard he tried. It's amazing how people can give up early on writing, especially at that time, I guess. Just a few rejections seemed to do it, and he turned to other things. And of course, he had 4 children. He was working 2 jobs, like many men at that time. I mean, 2 jobs was the regular thing for him. So I guess he didn't have the time to do it, or the desire to make the time to do it. But anyway, he was the first writer I ever really knew.
And you know what they say for everybody out there, don't quit before the miracle.
Yeah, right.
So the element of redemption, which is so much in your work, Lestat and Blood Canticle, Tale of the Body Thief, Blackwood Farm, and then it isn't quite so prominent in your work as it used to be. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, I guess I'm obsessed with it because I grew up in that beautiful Catholic universe where everything has an explanation and a place and is part of a harmony. And then I lost that faith in that religion, and I've been grieving for that ever since. I went back to it as an adult, and for 12 years I knew that coherence again. And once again I left because the faith wasn't there, just was not there. And though I remain a believer, I lost that coherent Catholic world. So I think there's always going to be an obsession with redemption, with the frightening prospect of having to work it out for yourself alone, without the consolation of organized religion or a belief system that you can fully embrace. And I do think it's in my work right now in Prince Lestat. I think very much Benji Mahmood, the little Bedouin vampire at the beginning who starts the radio station and tells everybody, look, we're a tribe and we're a parentless tribe and this isn't right. Where are our elders? We need some elders and some help and some parents. I think Benji's talking about redemption for the whole vampire underworld or whatever that exists in the novel.
I don't think it's not that much in the Wolf Gift Chronicles.
No, the Wolf Gift, I tried to do something else. That was a conscious decision to write another kind of supernatural novel that's filled with optimism and opportunity and open doors. And never at any point do those characters lament the fact that they have this Morphenkinder gift, this chrism, and can change into werewolves. I was into a different kind of experiment. You know, I'm always experimenting, as you know, and I make these twists and turns, and that's one reason that there's no consensus among my readers as to what's the best book or what's the best character or what was the best series. You know, it's wildly divergent, and I've learned to live with that, and I understand that, but it's because I do these twists and turns and detours, you know.
Which we celebrate, and we're happy that you do, instead of writing the same thing over and over and over again.
Right.
So the Christ the Lord books took a while, as really all of your books do. That was another huge leap of faith, really, not to make a pun, to find their full readership, but they did.
Yeah, they did, actually.
We'll talk a little bit about the readership for those books and the path the book's reception took, and how you felt about it.
Well, those books were different from anything I'd ever written because I was not trying to create my own alternative universe. I was trying to create a believable character, Jesus Christ, who was biblically correct, theologically correct, historically correct. And that was a huge challenge, just huge. And yet I was determined that character was going to be vital, and that he was going to, narrate the novels in the first person, and I wanted that character to be completely believable to every kind of reader. Readers of faith, readers with no faith, just readers of mine who bought my books. And it was quite an experience writing those books. It was joyful, but it was very, very difficult. And I do not think there'll ever be a third one. I think those two are going to be sort of like a 2-volume work on the private life of the Lord, basically, the private life of Jesus, or the early life of Jesus. And I found I couldn't take it into a third book about the ministry because I couldn't get into the theological fray over the ministry of Jesus. I simply couldn't go there. It was just not the place for me to go. But the readership, my readership expanded, and I got many, many, many believer readers who embraced those books very generously, and a lot of them had read my other books too, and they had a lot of interesting things to say. I also got some brand new readers who wouldn't think of reading my other stuff, and they were very generous and supportive of those books. It was a very interesting experience, and just a few days ago, the movie based on Christ the Lord out of Egypt stopped filming, or wrapped or whatever in Rome. They just ended the filming of it. So that movie is now done, and they can start working on the editing and so forth and so on. And I think it's going to be an absolutely wonderful movie. It's about Jesus as a child of 7 and 8. And the things that happened to him in the Holy Land at that time, and the world he sees as a child. And a great director is doing it. His name is Cyrus Narasta, and he's done a great film called The Stoning of Soroya M. I don't know how many have seen that film, but it's absolutely a wonderful film.
You know, the question just went out of my head. You said that, let me ask you this question. The interest in I know what I wanted to say. What was interesting was to watch your readers for those books have a sort of conversion about you, because they didn't really trust you in the beginning. They didn't they didn't know what your motives were, and then they read the books and and were opened by it.
That was true. It was a very curious experience. I was a believer. I was a Catholic when I wrote them, and a Christian, and I shared that very openly. And sometimes I wish I hadn't, but it was to reassure them that these books were sincere, that there was nothing. I wasn't deconstructing Jesus. There was no modern watering down of the biblical Jesus at all in those books. I was trying very hard to embrace the entire biblical picture and make it real, and talk about what it was like day in and day out for the little boy Jesus and the young man Jesus later on. And I think those are two of the best books I've ever been able to put together, really. But they are never going to have maybe the readership that the Vampire Chronicles will have. And there are reasons why, and I understand that, and I accept that. But it was very interesting meeting that entirely new readership. And I met many Christians and even some in religious life who said, we like what you did with Jesus, but we like the vampires better. No, that's true. I had a priest friend in Rome, and he said that. He said, I really, I miss those characters. And he was sort of telling me in a certain way that I'd been more effective talking about spiritual issues with the vampires, maybe, than I was in the novels about Christ.
I'm looking at this. There are so many other questions that I want to ask you, but I can see that we don't have a lot of time. So let me just say, there was one question I wanted to ask you. Oh, I know. It's a rather large question. And, it's really as a result of your feelings and your understanding of God and the way in which you carry through on that belief. And I wanted to ask you, how do you think the element of being loving has entered your work?
Oh my gosh, I think love can save the world. I keep thinking of that line from W.H. Auden, "We must love one another or die," that he wrote in 1939. I think that's a very main theme in my work. It's a very, very important theme, and certainly one of the most important parts of the Vampire Chronicles to me from the beginning has had to do with the love the characters have for one another. And I have experienced a lot of pain when people adapt my work and don't see that love and don't understand it. And one of the things I'll always be thankful for was that I do think Neil Jordan's Interview with the Vampire movie did capture that love between Lestat and Louis, and the love between Armand and Louis. But they're all about love in a way.
But I think the expression of it has changed in terms of that there's less, in a way, strife around it. Mm-hmm. But it's more fulsomely expressed, I think, in the later books.
Okay.
But that's my 2 cents on the subject. Anyway, all right. So now we're going to have some questions. There's a microphone here, and don't all rush to line up, because then we'll never end. Okay, the first person, sir.
The book that was given you about Jesus of Nazareth, and would you describe your storytelling technique?
Well, the book that was given to me was Jesus of Nazareth by Paula Fredrickson, and it's a scholarly book, really, from a fairly skeptical scholar about Jesus and what happened to him, basically. It's part of all the New Testament studies that are going on now today, where people are trying to take the primary sources and the secondary sources and get to the root, get to what they feel history and the source material actually tells us about Jesus. And it's a very good book, particularly in its portrayal of the Jewish people at that time. That's Paula Fredrickson's great field, and she does that very, very well. And the second question is, you wanted me to describe my writing process?
Your storytelling process, yeah. How do you do technique?
Oh, boy. Well, it always starts with characters. I see the characters before I see the story. The characters are living the story. That's really the way my imagination works. And the characters, when I sort of go with them and start writing about them and living through them, they tell me the story. You know, I may start with the idea, say, of a werewolf. What is that like to be a werewolf? What if you were a conscious werewolf? You didn't lose your mind when you became a beast. You actually remained completely conscious. What would that be like? The story then unfolds for me. I find the story through the character. It always works that way. There are times when I sit down and write a rough outline or a roadmap for myself through the novel, but the novel really comes to be through surprises and stumbling and discoveries. And of course, today working on a computer, that the computer is the most perfect instrument for that type of writing there's ever been, since you can go back and forth through the novel and bring everything up to the moment of present illumination over and over again.
Thank you.
I just want to say I was at the Lestat coronation ball this Halloween. Thank you for doing that. It was amazing.
Oh, good.
And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about the mythology of the Taltos and what inspired you to weave that onto Celtic history.
Thank you. Well, the Taltos, I came across the word in a book on folklore, and I liked that word Taltos, and I borrowed it, basically. There wasn't a whole lot in the book about it. It's some sort of mythical creature that was believed in the Middle Ages. And I kind of removed it from the setting in the book and invented this group of people that lived up in the north in an island that was actually very warm and tropical almost. And they're a different species of human being, basically. Or they're not human, but they're a two-legged and anthropomorphic intelligent species that are like humans. And I had a great deal of fun developing that. And again, they're spontaneous, trusting to the subconscious, just exploring my own world is where it all came from. Of course, it started with the novel The Witching Hour. The witches were haunted. Thank you. Thank you very much. The witches were haunted by this strange person, Lasher, and it was the mystery of Lasher. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's the mystery of Lasher that led to the development of the Taltos.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm just trying to go into what you genetics and, well, the idea that your father wrote the imp story. You know that character, that he's not physical in the beginning. There's somebody swirling around, yes? It's been a while since I read the witch books. But there was somebody, he's not physical yet.
Well, Lasher is a ghost.
Lasher,
he's
there we
trying
go.
To come true. He's
but
trying
then
to
it's
come
the
through.
ghost that's not physical with the physical. Yes, very interesting. Thank you for responding to your fans on Facebook, even though you have more than 1 million of them.
Thank you. I am really profoundly grateful to my fans on Facebook. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I will look at it. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming tonight. I have like a two-part question. The first would be, why did you or have you published some of your novels under a pseudonym instead of just Anne Rice? The best that I can think of right now is like The Claiming of Sleeping Beauty. I always wondered why you did that first, maybe to see how the book would do without Anne Rice written across it?
No, I did it to be free. I did it to be behind that mask so that I would make it pure pornography. Thank you. I had to be anonymous to do that. I couldn't be Anne Rice, from whom people expected a certain kind of novel. I had to be anonymous. Also, I didn't want my father to know. And that really was a big factor. I didn't want him to know. And what happened was the novels were doing fine, and they were very popular, actually, and I was afraid somebody was going to tell my dad. So I told him, and I said, just don't buy them, I don't read them. And he was very touched by my consideration, and then after that, I put my name on them. Because also I thought I was finished with them at that time, and I didn't write a fourth or a fifth, there were just 3, and I was plenty strong enough to take any reaction people had to them. It was the writing I had to protect, the writing process in the beginning. And the pseudonym had helped with that.
Okay, and my second question was, do you have plans now, or have you ever considered doing a story from Claudia's point of view?
No, I don't think I could do that. There is a graphic novel adaptation of Interview called Claudia's Story, but it's just based strictly on what's in Interview with the Vampire.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Sure.
Good evening. First of all, I would like to thank you on behalf of me and my friends in Siberia for bringing Lestat into our lives.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much.
It's been quite a life since we bonded when we were 14, and it's been wonderful to reconnect with him after having traveled to many of the places you wrote about in your books. My question relates to something you've touched upon in your conversation tonight, and that's the gender identity. I would say, first of all, why did you choose to write so much from a male perspective? What challenges did you face in writing from a male perspective, and how did you address them?
It wasn't challenging, it just seemed the natural way to do it. It seemed the easy and free way to do it, to write from a male point of view. It felt natural to me. I don't have a strong gender identity with women or men. I just don't think about gender, and I think that dealing with a female point of view put me too much in a world where gender matters and gender impinges. But this wasn't a conscious decision. I just sat down and wrote, and those characters were born, and they were males. And I think over the years I got more and more comfortable with writing from a female point of view. But it's still a bit confusing to me at times, especially when I think people are reacting to the female characters in ways that they do not react to the male characters. And I get a sense of unfairness and confusion. The male characters have an easier journey in this world than the female characters. There's no doubt about it.
All right. Thank you.
Sure.
Hello, Anne. First of all, thank you so much for coming to the Miami Book Fair. I wanted you to talk a little bit about how you were writing Louis' subconscious versus Lestat's point of view of being a vampire, and what was that like, because he's sort of, in Interview, he's very much like, no, you are this species, you can no longer care about humanity, they're your food, where Louis still wants to have that love and affection for them. And what was that like, trying to morph Louis into a vampire that didn't necessarily care for humans anymore and saw us as food instead of as human beings?
Well, that was certainly the whole theme of Interview with the Vampire, was that struggle of Louis being so reluctant to give himself up to what Lestat wanted him to do. And he perceived Lestat strictly as a villain, really, and an antagonist, and wrote very... only at one point in the novel does he finally concede, I hated him for all the wrong reasons. He realizes in Paris that he was never fair to Lestat, never really at all. And I ended the novel with some very vague notion that someday I wanted to tell Lestat's side of it.
Yeah,
that it would be fascinating to go into the side of someone who's presented in such black and white terms and see what his soul was about and his life was about. And I don't know any more about why I became Lestat after that instead of Louis, except that it happened. 8 years had passed, and when I wrote The Vampire Lestat, I was Lestat. I mean, he was more me than Louis, and I had a very hard time ever bringing Louis back into The Vampire Chronicles. I had a hard time going back to that melancholy, passive character that I had once been.
Well, thank you.
I just want to say I've gotten the signal that we have time for 3 more questions, but there are 5 people standing there. So if you ask your questions quickly, meaning that they can be answered quickly, then everybody can get a turn.
I'll try to answer quickly too.
Hi.
Okay. I know.
Hi there. It's wonderful to have you here, and I'm a big fan. And my question is actually stemmed from the conversations that you were having earlier. Did you get to visit the Bronte parsonage?
Oh, I did. I did visit the Bronte parsonage in Haworth, and I loved it. Absolutely loved it. It was a
I've been there
great moment.
myself.
It wasn't very long ago. It was about 3 years ago that I visited it and visited the town. And I'm going back to England next year, and I want to go back there and spend more time in Bronte country, really.
Wonderful. And what has been the shortest time for you to write a book and the longest? Like, how long has it taken you? And
Well, the Vampire Lestat took the longest in that it took over a year because I got blocked in the middle of it and couldn't go any further. But usually I write a book in about 6 to 8 weeks. And
Wow.
it's very, I think it's very important to me to get it done in that period of time. There's a lot of preparation for it, a lot of note-taking, but when I sit down and commit to making it work, I want to make it work in that period of time. And if it goes too much longer than that, it starts to have real problems for me. But 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes now a little longer than that, maybe 10 weeks. But no more than 12 weeks, really. That, to me, is the best for uniformity of tone, uniformity of feeling, and a complete embrace of everything happening in the book. When it takes longer than that, then there are real problems of unevenness and incoherence and having to go back and so forth. So I really very much believe in that method for me, but I don't believe there are any rules for all authors. We all do
Okay.
what works.
well, thank you very much. It's great seeing you.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't want to be stingy, but just please ask one question so everybody can get a chance.
Hi, Anne.
Who's online?
I just wanted to know, what was your inspiration for writing Exit to Eden? What was going through your mind?
For writing what?
Exit to Eden?
Oh, Exit to Eden. Well, it was, again, I wanted to write pornography, and I wanted to write a really sexy S&M romance, and I wanted to create this club where everybody could go to act out their fantasies with perfect safety. I'm always in my erotica looking for a safe place for the people to be happy and do S&M. That's all what it's all about.
Have you ever done S&M? Thank you.
Okay.
Hi. It really resonates with me the way that you channel your characters from an astral sense. What advice would you give to young authors to tap into that limitless potential?
I would say trust yourself. I think it's very important for you to trust yourself, trust your voice, trust your imagination. Write the book that you really want to read, the book you really want to be in, and don't let yourself be pushed and pulled by a lot of outside influences when you're writing a book. Really get down with your bad self and do it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. Which one was your favorite to write? Out of all the books that you wrote, which was the most enjoyable for you to write?
Oh, I think it was Christ the Lord, The Road to Cana. I think I was just floating when I wrote that book. It was such a joy to write that book. I never experienced anything like it. But I've enjoyed writing most of my books. I've written books in dark depression and misery, and I've written books in happiness and high spirits. And I don't think anybody would know which ones are which. But Christ the Lord, The Road to Cana was just, I wasn't on the earth. I wasn't with people. I was just in that book. That was it.
And it's a pleasure to see you, and also feeling like I'm about to take communion. But I just want to ask you about violin. It's one of the ones, from my perspective, that I don't know a lot of people who've read it, and I know pieces of you are everywhere in your writing, and my conception is that I feel the closest to you when I read that book, which I read.
Really?
I read like I listen to a song. I love it. I just want to tell me how much of you is in there and how.
Oh, that book was so personal for me. It was all about my enormous love of music and the desire to make music and the tragedy that I had no talent to do it. And it was a book in which I put more of my own personal experience and travels than I usually do with any book. And it almost drove me a bit crazy to do that book, to go that far into the pain I felt over the death of my daughter and the question of art and madness and the kinds of blood that exist in this world, the natural fluid, the blood of procreation, and the blood that comes from violence. I nearly went nuts writing that book. I turned myself inside out, so I'm very happy to hear that you responded to it, because it has this, okay.
Okay, I just... Thank you all, and I just want to say, wish everybody a wonderful Thanksgiving, and let's thank Anne for a great evening.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for everything. Thank you. Thank you.